This question appeared on a video which was explaining how to loop through a collection of Excel workbooks in a single folder to open up each workbook in turn and then copy the contents into a single workbook. This user wants to do something similar, but this time using image files with an added complication. There's not just one single main folder, there's a collection of subfolders as well, and we wanted to be able to loop through all of the folders and subfolders to import all the files. I'm not entirely certain of the exact aim of importing the images, but that's okay because he's figured out that part himself. So I've made up a basic example just to do something interesting, but the main focus of this video is about how to loop through folders and subfolders. Just to demonstrate what we're going to build together in the video, this is the final result. There's a button that's going to get a bunch of photos, and it's going to get those photos from a folder sitting within the same folder that this workbook belongs to. Inside the photos folder, these are just a random collection of photos I've taken over the past 12 months or so walking around near where I live. So there's a bunch of loose files sitting in the photos folder, but there's also a subfolder in there with some loose files sitting in it. And again, there's another subfolder in there with a collection of loose files, but also even more subfolders. So basically we need to be able to traverse the full chain of folders and subfolders to import everything into this workbook. The end result isn't particularly attractive. If I just hit the Get Photos button just to demonstrate what we're aiming towards. I've disabled the screen updating to try to speed things up. I suppose I should have used a few less photos, but there we go. The end result will be a separate row for each folder that we import our photos from, with the folder path sitting just above the photos, and we'll end up with something not too complicated, but something interesting to look at the end. Okay, so here's the basic starting point. I've reverted back to a blank Excel workbook, and I've saved it as a macro-enabled workbook in the same folder as my photos folder. I won't bother providing you guys with the photos themselves. I'm sure you've got plenty of your own to work with, but you'll just need to organise those into some kind of folder and subfolder organisation so you've got something to work with. What I'm then going to do is head into the Developer tab and then open up the Visual Basic Editor. And from there I'm going to insert a new module. And because we're going to be working with files and folders a lot in this video, I'm going to set a reference to the Microsoft Scripting Runtime object library that makes life a lot easier when you've got lots of things to do with files and folders. So from the Tools menu, I'm going to choose References. And then from the list, I'm going to scroll down to find Microsoft Scripting Runtime. And when I've found that, I can check the box next to it and then click OK. And having set a reference to that library, the first thing I'll do in the module is declare a variable which will hold a reference to something called a FileSystemObject. So that's a generic object which we can use to manipulate files and folders. So I'm going to declare this as a module level variable. So I'm going to say private FSO as, and I'd like this to be an auto instancing variable. Basically, I want VBA to create a new instance of the FileSystemObject class whenever I need one without me having to specify that I want to create a new one. So to do that, I can say as new scripting.FileSystemObject. For the first procedure we'll create in this module, I'd like to create a subroutine which can list out all of the files in any given folder. And I'd like to provide the name of the folder or the path to the folder to the subroutine whenever I call it. So I'm going to declare a new subroutine. Let's call this one Process Files. And then in a set of round brackets, I'm going to declare a parameter into which we can pass the folder path. Let's call it something like path to folder or something along those lines as string. Inside the subroutine, I'm going to declare a couple of variables to help me loop through the collection of files in the folder whose path we've specified. So I'm going to say dim fol as scripting.folder and then dim f as scripting.file. I then want to get a reference to the folder whose path I've passed in. So I'm going to say set fol equals fso.getFolder. What I can then do is open some more round brackets and then pass in the reference to our path to folder parameter. So path to folder. Finally, to loop through the collection of files in that folder, I can write a for each loop. So I'm going to say for each f in fol.files and then close the loop by saying next f. And then inside that loop, let's do something simple like debug.print f.path. Next, I'd like to be able to test that this basic part of my subroutine is working. But I can't just run this subroutine in the usual way by clicking somewhere inside it and either pressing F5 or clicking the Run button. And the reason I can't run this subroutine is that when I do run it, I've got to provide the path to the folder whose files I want to loop over. So I've got a few choices here. One fairly simple way would be to use the immediate window. If you don't have the immediate window displayed, head to the View menu and choose Immediate Window. And then in the immediate window, I can type in the name of my subroutine. So I've just pressed Control and Spacebar to get the IntelliSense list to appear. I can say Process Files, and then I could type in the full path to the folder that I want to loop through the files of. Or I could do something a little cleverer and say this workbook.path, and then concatenate to the end of that /photos, which is the name of the folder sitting in the same folder as this workbook is. So having done that, I can press enter, and we should see that we get a couple of items listed out, and these are the names of the files that are sitting loosely in the photos folder. Now, one other way to do that, to avoid having to write out that piece of information each time in the immediate window, let's just clear the contents of the immediate window. An alternative way to do it is to write a subroutine to trigger the processing of the files. So let's say sub start processing files. And then in here, we can make a call to the process files procedure. So let's press Control and Spacebar, process files, this workbook.path, ampersand, and then in some double quotes, /photos. And then if I run this subroutine, we'll see the same output appears in the immediate window, the list of photos in that folder. Now let's add the code that will loop through all of the subfolders in the folder whose path we've just provided. So in this case, there will be two folders, birds and deer. So to make that work, back in the same process files subroutine, I'm going to declare a new variable. I'm going to call this one dim subfol as a scripting.folder. And then after I've finished processing the files with that for each loop, I'm going to add a second for each loop, which is going to say for each subfol in fol.subfolders. A couple of blank lines and then say next subfol to close off that loop. And then I'm just going to, once again, debug.print subfol.path. Okay, having done that, I can go back to my start processing files subroutine, and having clicked in there, I can run that subroutine, and this time we should see 4 items, so 2 file names, and then 2 folder names. Next, what we need to do is, rather than just print out the path of the subfolder, we want to pass that subfolder path into a subroutine, which will loop through all of the files in that folder, and then loop through all the subfolders in that folder. And we don't need to write another subroutine in order to do that. The subroutine we're going to call to perform that task is the one that we're in the middle of writing. It's the process files subroutine. So let's just replace debug.print with a call to the process files subroutine. Now, if this is the first time you've ever written this style of code where you've called a subroutine from within the same subroutine, this is going to feel very strange and unnatural. This is referred to as recursive code. It's a subroutine which calls itself to repeat the same tasks. I'm going to explain how it works in just a moment, but just to demonstrate first of all that it does work, let's select our start processing file subroutine and then hit the run button, and you'll see that fairly rapidly we get a printout of every single file name from the complete sequence of folders and subfolders in whichever organization you've got. So it is actually working. Now, demonstrating that the procedure does work is a little easier than trying to explain how it works, particularly if you haven't seen recursive procedures before, but I'll do my best to explain what's going on. I'm going to begin by clicking into the Start Processing Files subroutine and press the F8 key to begin stepping through that procedure. Before I do anything else, I'm going to display a window called the Call Stack. So I'm going to head up to the View menu and choose Call Stack, or press Ctrl and L on the keyboard. What the call stack shows you in VBA is a list of all of the procedures that are currently running in this project. So you can see there's only one procedure running, it's start processing files. Now I'd like to be able to carry on stepping through while the call stack is displayed, but sadly I can't. It's a modal dialog box, so I have to close down the call stack before I can continue. So I'll carry on pressing F8 to launch the process files subroutine. And then before I carry on running anything in that subroutine, I'm going to press Ctrl and L again, just to demonstrate that we now have two procedures running. So you can see that process files has been added to the top of the stack. So the start processing files subroutine hasn't finished yet, but it's sitting at the bottom of the stack, and it's going to wait until the process files procedure has finished before it can itself continue. It's not particularly useful at this point, but I could, if I wanted to, select the start processing files subroutine and then choose to show what position or what instruction, which statement is currently being executed in that subroutine. So if I click the show button, a green arrow appears next to the line that was last executed in that subroutine. Not particularly informative, of course, because there is only one instruction in there, but with more complex procedures, that's quite a handy thing to be able to do. So at this point, I'm going to start pressing F8 again to continue through the process files procedure. And of course, it's going to loop through all of the files in the folder whose path we've just passed in. So there are only two loose files in there, this picture of a dog and one of a squirrel. So if I use F8 to step through there, we've got a couple of lines printed out in the immediate window. Then we get into the loop which is going to process the subfolders collection. So I'm going to hit F8 to call the process files subroutine again. Now when you're watching this in the Visual Basic Editor, when I hit F8, it simply looks as though we've skipped to the top of the line in the same subroutine. But that's not quite strictly true. If I press Ctrl and L, hopefully what you can see here is that we have two running copies of the process files subroutine. The newest opened copy goes to the top of the stack, and the rest of the procedures can't finish until this one has finished. Again, it's sometimes handy to be able to see what line was running in the previous copy of that procedure. So if I click on that previous process files procedure and then click show, you can see that it's basically paused at executing the process files subfolder path instruction. I'll carry on pressing the F8 key at this point. So at this point, I'm looking at the first subfolder within the photos folder. So that should be looking at the birds folder. It's going to then find any files which are sitting in that folder. So if I go into the birds folder, there are 4 files listed there. If I start using the F8 key to continue stepping through, we can see more lines get written out into the immediate window, and there should be 4 files with the names of those birds. Then we're going to look if there are any subfolders in the birds folder. So there are, of course. There's 4 subfolders, the first one being called buzzard. So if I hit F8 and then F8 again to call process files, I'm going to then press Ctrl and L to display the call stack, and we've now got a stack of 4 procedures, 3 copies of process files running at different positions, and the original call to start processing files. So this is basically what's happening. Each time we make a call to process files, it's going to open up a new copy of that procedure. So I've just finished looping through the photos in the buzzard folder. Now I'm going to check if there are any subfolders in the buzzard folder. If I double click into there, you'll see that there aren't any subfolders. So this loop is effectively is skipped over, nothing happens there. And then this is the first time we've found and encountered an end sub. So just before I execute that, I've got 3 copies of process files running. As soon as I execute end sub, you'll see it returns to the next line in the previous call to the process files subroutine. If I press Ctrl and L, we've now only got 2 copies of process files running. Then I'm going to move on to the next subfolder. So basically we've gone up 1 level. So we've finished with the buzzard folder, we go back up to the previous level and then find the next subfolder in there, which is kestrel, and we will then make another call to process files, which of course opens up another copy in the call stack, and so on and so on and so on. So all the files in the kestrel folder get written out. There are 3 or 4 of those, 4 altogether, but there they all are, the 4 Kestrel photos. And then it checks if there are any subfolders in there. Of course there aren't, so it will then return to the previous level and then move on to the next subfolder. I'm not going to carry on now at this point and waste your time and explain every single step. That exact same sequence is carried out so that the procedure will traverse the entire sequence of folders and subfolders. So I'm just going to hit F5 at this point and we'll reach the very end of the list with every single file in that collection of folders listed out. So at this point, we've basically answered the core part of the question. How do we loop through a collection of folders and subfolders with the same procedure? What you do with the files that you're looping over is entirely up to you, but you basically control that by writing the code inside this for each f in fol.files loop. So from this point on, all we're going to be dealing with is inserting pictures into an Excel worksheet. And if you're not interested in that, then you're not going to learn anything more about working with files and folders. Feel free to stop watching at this point. If you are interested in inserting pictures into an Excel worksheet, then we'll go through a few techniques you need to know. So the first thing I'm going to do, because I'd like to be able to manipulate the picture I'm going to insert, I'm going to declare a variable to capture a reference to it to make it easier to manipulate afterwards. So I'm going to say dim sh as shape. Then, after printing out the path of the shape or the path of the picture, I'm going to say set sh equals, and then I'm going to refer to sheet 1 for this first example. I'm going to put my picture onto the existing worksheet and I'm going to reference it by its code name, sheet 1, followed by a full stop, then refer to the shapes collection and then use the add picture method. There are 2 add picture methods, add picture and add picture 2. The only difference is that add picture 2 has an extra parameter which allows you to compress the images that you've inserted into the worksheet. So in fact, let's use the add picture 2 method, and I'm going to open up some round brackets to see the parameter list. They're all compulsory parameters. Unfortunately, I can't get away with missing out any of these. You see there are no parameter names listed in square brackets. So what I'm going to do is on separate lines, starting with the file name parameter, I'm going to say file name colon equals f.path. And then on the next line, so I'm going to type in a comma space underscore, I'm going to refer to the link to file parameter, and I'm going to make that equal to MSO false. So I'm not linking to the files, I'm importing them and saving them in the workbook. Then comma space underscore, and on the next line I'm going to say save with document. It would be nice if the parameter names appeared in the IntelliSense, but sadly that's not happening. Save with document, I'm going to set that to MSO true, so the files get saved, the pictures get saved within the Excel workbook. And then the next set of parameters to fill in, left, top, width and height. This is how you control the size and position of any object in Excel. So when you've got drawing objects on a page, you specify the distance from the left of the sheet to the left of the shape, the distance from the top of the sheet to the top of the shape, and then the width and the height in points. So all these measurement units are in points. To begin with, I'm going to set the left property to be equal to 0, so that will make it sit at the extreme left-hand edge of the worksheet. And I'm going to set the top property, the top parameter, to be equal to 0 as well, so that's going to sit at the extreme top of the worksheet. Then for the width and the height, I need to specify both here. Now, I'm not quite sure of the dimensions of the pictures I'm inserting. I don't want to risk distorting the images by stretching them by specifying odd width and height combinations. So what I'm going to do to begin with is say width colon equals, sorry, that should have been a colon, equals -1. So that will make it use the default width of the shape. Then I'm going to type in a comma space underscore and set the height parameter to also be -1. What I'm then going to do after I've finished inserting the shape is resize it, but there's one final parameter to specify, and that's the compress parameter. So compress colon equals, I'm going to set MSO picture compress true. Having done that, I can close the round brackets, and that will insert the shape and pass back a reference to the shape to my sh variable. So now that I've got the shape available, I'm going to reduce its height to sh.height equals, let's go fairly small, let's go for 100 points. Okay, now I'm not going to make this happen for every single shape. I don't want to run the entire procedure at this point. I'm just going to step through so that the first picture gets inserted. So I'm going to restore down my VB editor window, and hopefully we can see the Excel window in the background there as well. And then if I use the F8 key to begin running the Start Processing Files subroutine, and we should see our first picture gets inserted onto the page. Eventually, quite large as you can see. And then I'm going to reduce the height down to 100 points, and that will correspondingly change the width but maintain the aspect ratio as well. So there we go, we've got the first picture inserted. I'm just going to stop running the subroutine at that point because you might be able to spot the obvious problem here. I've specified that every image should be inserted at the top left-hand corner of the worksheet. So we now need to start working out how to reposition the objects once they've been inserted. The next thing we'll do is get all of our pictures to appear in a single row across the top of the worksheet. And in order to do that, I need to keep track of the next left position for each image that I insert. To help with that, I'm going to declare a module level variable. I'm going to say private next left as single. Now that variable will be initialized to a 0. But I'm going to make sure of that by going down to the Start Processing Files subroutine and making sure that every single time I begin processing files, that next left is set to 0. Because it's a module level variable, it will retain its value between procedure calls. So I want to make sure that I don't inadvertently make things fall off the edge of the worksheet by forgetting to reset that. Then what we're going to do, each time we insert an image, we're going to set the left position not equal to 0, but equal to the next left position. And then, after having resized the shape, we're going to update the value of the next left variable. So we're going to say next left equals, and then I'm going to make it equal to itself, so next left, plus the current width of the picture we've just inserted. And I can do that by referring to sh.width. If I'd like to leave a bit of a gap between my images, I can also add on an arbitrary number of points. So let's leave a gap of 10 points between each picture. But that updates the next left position so that the next picture will be not laid over the top of the first one. Let's just give that a quick test, and I'm going to restore down my immediate window, or sorry, my VB editor window. Select the picture of the dog. That's my mum's dog, by the way, not mine. And then I'm going to go down to the Start Processing Files procedure and hit the F8 key to begin stepping through. So we should see the picture of the dog gets inserted and then resized. And then we're going to recalculate the value of the next left. So currently it's set to 0. After I recalculate it, it's now set to 160. So that must mean that the width of the image is 150 because we've then added 10 to that. So we can then insert the next image, and that you can see there's a gap of 10 points there. We resize the image height and then calculate the next left position, which is quite precise, that one of course, but there we go. And then it goes into the subfolders and starts again. So hopefully you can see we're building up this single row of images. At this point I'm just going to stop stepping through, and I'm just going to manually delete these images from sheet 1 and then resize my VB window again and work out next how we start putting each folder on a separate row. At this point, I'd like to add the code that will generate the new worksheet that all of the pictures will be inserted into, rather than continuing to use sheet 1 and having to delete the shapes each time. So to make that work, I'm going to declare a variable at the top of the module to keep track of the new worksheet that we create. So I'm going to say private pick sheet equals, or beg pardon, as worksheet. Then I want to create that pick sheet in the initial subroutine which kicks off the entire process. So down to the Start Processing Files subroutine, I'm going to say set pick sheet equals this workbook dot worksheets .add. Finally, I just need to update the code that's adding the pictures from sheet 1 to picsheet.shapes.addPicture2. Next, I'd like to add the code that will write out the path of the folder just above the row of pictures that we're about to paste in. To help with that, let's declare another variable. So up at the top of the module, I'll say private next cell as range. And then in the original subroutine, the one which kicks off the entire process, just after creating our new worksheet, I'm going to say set next cell equals picsheet.range A1. So our first folder path is going to get written into cell A1 of that new worksheet. To make that happen, let's head back up into the main subroutine, the one that does all the heavy lifting. And just after we've captured a reference to the folder, but before we start looping through the files in the folder, let's say next cell dot value equals fol.path. I suppose I could equally easily have used a reference to the path to folder parameter. This parameter and this property effectively hold the same string at this point. What we next need to make sure of is that once we've finished processing all of the files in that folder, before we move on to the next one, we've calculated where the next cell will be. In order to do that, I would like to refer to the cell that is 2 rows below the bottom right-hand corner of the last shape we've just inserted, which sounds quite complicated, but is in fact quite simple, because there's a property that returns a reference to the bottom right cell that a shape covers. So I'm going to say set next cell equals sh, which will be whichever the last shape we've just inserted will be, dot bottom right cell, and that returns a reference to a range object. So from there I can offset 2 rows down. So I'm going to say dot offset 2, 0, and then I want to come back to the left hand side of the worksheet so that my path is written into column A. So one way to do that is to say dot end XL2 left, and I can then close the round brackets. Now that we've calculated the location of the next cell, we can use that to calculate the top position for the new row of shapes we're about to paste in. Let's once again declare a new variable to help with that. So I'm going to head up to the top of the module again, and on the same line as I've declared my next left variable, I'm going to type in a comma and say next top as single. By the way, don't be tempted just to write a comma separated list of variable names. So don't say next left comma next top as single. That only declares one single variable, and everything else will be declared as a variant. So do make sure you always specify the type of every variable you declare. So next left as single, comma next top as single. Then I'm going to head back down to the start processing files subroutine, and just before next left I'm going to say next top equals, and then I'm going to refer to the value of the top property of the cell that is one below next cell. So in other words, I'm going to say next cell dot offset, dot offset 1, 0 dot top. Okay. Once I've done that, I can copy and paste those 2 lines of code, and I'm going to place those just below where we've calculated the next cell in the main subroutine. So we can say next top equals next cell dot offset 1, 0 dot top, and then next left equals 0. This line is just to ensure that each time we begin a new row of shapes, the pictures get inserted at the left hand side, so we come back to the left hand edge of the worksheet before beginning the new row. Finally, I just need to make sure that in the code which adds the picture, I don't just continue referring to the value 0. I want to replace the value of 0 for the top parameter with the next top variable. The final bit of code I'm going to add is going to just check that the folder we're currently looking at actually has some files in it. So at the moment our code will still, even if the folder doesn't contain any files, it's still going to write out the folder path into the next cell, and then the for each loop won't really do anything, but after the for each loop has ended, it's going to try to calculate the next cell position to generate the next row, and that's unnecessary because we haven't written out any files into that row anyway. So just to guarantee that that doesn't happen, let's add a quick if statement just after we've captured a reference to the folder. I'm going to say if fol.files.count is greater than 0, then we can do all these things. We can write out the folder path, loop through all the files in the folder. Once we've finished looping through the files, we can calculate the position for the next row and then work out the initial position for the next picture by calculating the next top and the next left. And then finally end if just before we begin looping over the subfolders in that folder. Okay, well I think we're ready to give the whole thing a test, so let's head back into the Excel workbook, and then from the Developer tab we can go to the Insert tool in the ribbon, and I'm going to insert a basic form control button, so I'll click on that tool. If you want your buttons to line up exactly with the edges of cells when you draw it, hold down the Alt key while you click and drag and you'll find the button snaps to the edges of cells, quite satisfying that. And then I can assign my Start Processing Files subroutine or macro to that button. I'll change the text on the button, let's call it Get Photos or something along those lines. And then if I click away from the button and then click on it, it's not the most exciting one to watch, at least in my case. You don't see the photos appear until the entire thing is finished, at least. But we do see the folder paths being written out. And eventually, when the whole system is finished, we ought to end up with a lovely list of photos, each one arranged in a neat row, just underneath the folder path from which those photos come. So there we go, that's our basic system finished. I'm sure you could make lots of improvements to the way that works if you felt like it. Hopefully it answers the original question, or at least the main part of the question, which of course was about looping through folders and subfolders. And that entire system is driven by this ability to create a subroutine which can call itself, passing in a relevant value for each separate call that it makes. So not an awful lot of code there required to do quite a lot of work. Hope you found that one useful. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time.